Hello, and welcome to Speak Honest. I am your host and certified relationship coach, Jennifer Noble. It has been my passion for over a decade to help women like you heal what's been holding you back from having the relationships you deserve. Are you struggling with a relationship where you can't seem to voice your emotions, needs, and boundaries without having it blow up in your face? Then you have found the right podcast, my friend. Get ready for practical tips, empowering truths, and honest conversations. Now, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Speak Honest. I'm Jen Noble, your certified relationship coach. And on today's episode, we are going to dive into everything to do with relationship triggers. You know, those moments when your partner does something or says something and it just sets you off and you're not quite sure why. Yeah. That's what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm really excited to start to go down that road with you because our goal here is to enhance communication and connection in our relationships by understanding what triggers us and then learning how to manage those triggers effectively. But before we get started, I want to ask, have you ever found yourself stuck in a pattern, reacting to the same thing over and over again in your relationships, and you wish that you had some extra support to figure it all out? Well, now is your chance. So I'm offering a few select spots for the upcoming month for listeners to come on the podcast for a free coaching session with me. We'll work through whatever relationship challenges you're facing. So whether it's triggers or communication breakdowns or anything in between, I'll guide you towards real solutions right here on the show. And if that sounds like something you'd love to be a part of, I want you to email me at jennifer@speak-honest.com, or you can click on the link in the show notes to schedule with me directly. Or as always, you can come and join the Facebook group and you can just ask me in there. So if you're listening to the episode today and you're really resonating with some of these triggers that I'm talking about, go ahead, schedule that call. Let's talk together and let's do this. But now let's get on to the episode. So let's start by defining what a trigger is. Triggers aren't just uncomfortable emotions. They're not just anger and sadness and, frustration and rage. A trigger is an emotional reaction that is disproportionate to the current situation. So if the situation is a 5 out of 10, but you're reacting to it more like a 9 out of 10, then you are triggered. Now, it's important to remember that triggers are inside of us. Our buttons, they wouldn't be pushed if we didn't have the button to push in the first place. You do get it? So this is why our goal is to learn how to find our triggers, how to calm them down, and then eventually how to remove them. So let's start with what some of the most common triggers are. I think most people have been triggered when they've been ignored or criticized or abandoned. Yeah, those are some of the quite big situations where they can be obvious. But the not so obvious triggers would be more like maybe someone's running late, or they don't do something when we ask them to, or they don't load the dishwasher the way that we want them to, right? Am I right? Please tell me I'm right on that one. And these are all triggers because remember again, it's never about the situation. It's about our reaction to the situation. And is our reaction matching the situation or going above it? And that's when we want to observe. It is crucial to observe when you're triggered. So if something happens and you're feeling off, start getting curious. I love to say, get curious, not furious. I want you to notice a sudden change in your mood. Were you happy a minute ago, but your partner just came home and now you're feeling incredibly angry? Or what's your somatic experience? What's your physical sensations? What are they telling you? Were you perfectly fine until your mom started commenting on your daughter's dress? Keep an eye out on your body in these moments. And as always, the big one to notice is a big, strong emotional reaction. Are you yelling, screaming, sobbing, unable to breathe? These are all indicators that you are most likely triggered. And awareness is the first step to managing triggers. So pay attention to what your body is telling you. Now, if you want to try this at home right now, you can actually take a moment to think about your own personal triggers. So what situation or behavior from others tend to set you off? and have a strong response in you. So you can pause the podcast if you want to right now and have a think about that, or you can write it down in your journal and think about it later on. But think about that. What situations or behaviors from others tend to set you off? That's a great way to start getting more aware of what your triggers are. But now that we're starting to see our triggers in the moment, let's dig into why they're there in the first place. Why does that freaking button even exist? And why do certain people in our lives just love pressing it? See, triggers are often tied to past experiences, unmet needs, unspoken boundaries, or covert expectations. So I want to break these each down. So let's look at past experiences. This is like PTSD. If something happened to you in the past and you're confronted with that moment again, you may feel triggered. For example, I remember the first time I walked into a hospital right after my dad had just passed away. This was probably at least a year later, so I wasn't even thinking, anything of it. I didn't think it was a big deal. I was just going to the hospital to see my friend. She was having a baby. But when I walked into that hospital and I got onto the elevator, this wave of emotions just came over me and I started sobbing. Now, looking back, I can see, my mind went back to that moment when I spent a week in the hospital with my dad and he didn't make it. And that was traumatic. So now a year later, I'm having a disproportionate reaction to the situation at hand. The situation being, I'm just in a freaking elevator. But you can see how that pushed my buttons and how it made me cry. Now let's look at unspoken needs and boundaries. So in addition to past experiences, a massive reason we get triggered is when we aren't speaking up for the things we need and we're not setting clear boundaries around this. Now, I know I've talked about boundaries in the past, and if you want to go listen to it, it's one of the previous episodes. It helps explain the different types of boundaries and all of that. But the goal here is to understand that if our partners do something, like they take their shoes off when they come home and then they just leave them in the hallway, if that triggers us to the point where we start yelling at them or we shut down or we pick up their shoes and we throw them outside, that means there's an unmet need or a boundary that needs to be spoken into existence. So working on what your needs and boundaries are will be huge for this. Lastly, one thing that I see often in relationships that elicit big triggers are covert expectations. Now, what are these? These are those expectations we hold on to so tightly that we don't even realize they're an expectation. We just assume everyone around us should know that this is the way things are. But the reality is everyone is just living in their own world. They have their own perceptions and their own mind map. Let me give you an example of this. Here, where I live, it seems to be pretty much the norm. You take your shoes off when you go into someone's house. See, I never grew up this way, though. And in fact, after all of these years, I'm still not that way. I prefer to keep my shoes on all the times. It makes me feel more comfortable. And since I grew up that way, this makes sense to me. But when I first moved here, I went over to a friend's house and I left my shoes on. And how do you think she reacted? Well, thankfully she was kind and compassionate and just said, "Oh, hey, can you take your shoes off, please?" But imagine if for some reason she was triggered by this. If she got mad at me or passive aggressive with me or snarky, would that have been fair to me? No, of course not. She would have been putting her covert expectations onto me. And that's what we want to work on. So really look inward and ask yourself, if you're triggered, was I expecting my partner to do something? And that's why I'm upset. So really look inward and ask yourself, if you're triggered, were you expecting your partner to do something in that moment, and then that's now why you're upset? This is why understanding the root cause of a trigger can help us manage it more effectively. Now that we know a bit more about triggers, what they are and where they come from, let's do another exercise. So I want you to think of a recent triggering event. Let's all take a moment right now. Again, if you're in a safe place, close your eyes, soften your gaze, place a hand on your heart, one on your belly. Really breathe into these spaces of your heart and your stomach. And now think about a time recently when you had a heightened reaction to something someone else did. Maybe it was your partner, maybe a family member. Maybe your child was whining or someone cut you off in traffic. Once you have this moment in your mind, I want you to reflect on what might have caused that reaction. Was it a past experience? Or perhaps an unmet need? Was there maybe a boundary that got crossed? But now that you're thinking about it, you see you never actually communicated that boundary. Was there an expectation that wasn't getting met? Get really clear, and once you're ready and you have a bit of a better understanding, come back up with me. So go ahead and pause it again if you need to. But once you're ready, come back up, flutter your eyes open, and come back into the moment with me. Beautiful. So now that we know what a trigger is and where it comes from, let's talk about what to do when it shows up. A few simple techniques when you feel a trigger boiling beneath the surface are to pause and breathe. I really like box breathing myself because it really calms me down and it's easy to remember. There's also self-reflection, setting boundaries, and communicating clearly what you need now that you have it figured out. Now, of course, if you're hella triggered, 10 out of 10, you can always try using my RAISE method that we talk about often. And again, I'll remind you, RAISE stands for remove yourself, anchor yourself, identify your feelings and emotions, check in with the stories that you're telling yourself, and then equilibrate. See, RAISE. This method will help you regulate your emotions in the moment before you go back to your partner and start communicating. And lastly, with all this trigger talk, one thing I want to get across that is really important is that we will continue to have triggers throughout our lives. This is part of the human experience. So while yes, you can work towards removing the buttons so they don't get pressed, you're also asking a lot of yourself to think that you can remove all of them. Just like I would love to have a six-pack and some strong-ass legs, the amount of work required to get there is just too much for me to do practically. And the truth is, to get to a place of being fully detached and never being triggered, while yes, it is actually possible, it just isn't practical. So don't go into this thinking that you've failed if you ever still have triggers. Instead, I want you to be compassionate for yourself in these moments. And not just because I want you to be kind to yourself. There are scientific and tangible reasons why this is helpful. Practicing self-compassion actually reduces the emotional intensity of a trigger and even lessens the time we stay in that triggered state. So when those big reactions come up and you can't control them, that's okay. Just see if you can remove yourself, breathe through it, tell yourself you're safe, and it's okay that you had this reaction. It's not your fault. You are doing the best you can with the tools that you have. And now, after this episode, hopefully you have a couple more tools. So, let's go ahead and summarize everything we've talked about. Remember, observe your triggers, don't judge them, get curious, and then next, see if you can find the root cause. What's going on? Is it from the past? Is it an unmet need, a covert expectation? And then lastly, practice self-compassion. Really utilizing these steps in any which way can help you immensely to manage your emotional responses and improve your relationships. As we wrap up today, I'm going to leave you with this one question to ask yourself. What is one strategy you can use to manage a trigger better? If you have an answer for that and you want to tell me, you can always email me, Jennifer@speak-honest.com, or jump into the Facebook group and say, hey, Jen, I thought of a strategy I can use to manage my triggers better. I would love to hear from you. With all that said, I just want to say thank you so much again for listening to the episode today with us. And if you are interested in having a free coaching call with me right here on this podcast so we can get you help and the women who are listening help as well, I would love to have you on the podcast. Click the link in the show notes or reach out to me at any time and let's connect. All right, everyone. Have a beautiful week. I will talk to you later. Take care. As we wrap up today's conversation, always remember that healing is a journey, not a destination. And it is an honor to be a part of your healing journey. If you want to dig deeper into the topics we covered today, be sure to head over to our show notes where you can find all of the valuable information mentioned in today's episode right there. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe if you enjoyed today's podcast. Your feedback means the world to us and helps others discover our podcast. Until next time, remember to speak up and speak honest.